Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is November 29th. Well, this morning we woke up to snow falling down. It's going to snow all day. No sun. It feels a little dark out. There were a ton of accidents on the road as I took John to school. But on the bright side, it is fabulous snow for a snowman or snowballs. And every time I threw the tennis ball for Max, it gathered snow, just rolling to a stop, and Max had to sniff just to find it. But anyway, Max loves the snow. He could have played fetch for hours in it. I made it about 40 minutes, which I thought was pretty good. It is wet and cold out. I continue to trim away at the buckthorn on the edge of the park in between my throws, and I brought my big pruners today, so I made a little bit more progress. And it's so much easier to prune buckthorn in the winter than it is at any other time of year. So I love doing that. Well, yesterday on my way home from the cabin, I had a great talk with a listener named Donna. She used to live in Minnesota, but now she's down in Florida. And so she appreciates my little updates on what the weather's doing. Makes her feel a little bit more connected to home. And boy, a snowy day like today is definitely a Minnesota day. Anyway, it was a great little chat. And surprisingly, we didn't talk that much about gardening. Isn't that crazy? Usually when I talk to a fellow gardener, that's what I end up doing. We end up going down these rabbit holes of different flowers or herbs or pests in the garden. But aside from talking a little bit about cottage gardening, because Donna used to live in England, we really didn't dig too deep on the topic of gardening, pardon the pun, but that's okay. It is totally fine. You know, gardening provides that commonality and that common language, but it's also a great springboard to friendship, isn't it? And how many friends have you and I made thanks to gardening? Well, I can go through my own address book, my own contact list, and say with all sincerity that the majority of my friends are gardeners, which is wonderful. And you know, speaking about being social and connecting with others, I have a little tip for you. There is a social media platform. It's called Mastodon. Maybe you've heard of it. It's an alternative to Twitter, and I joined it last week, and I've been sharing little pieces of garden history in addition to photos of Max, of course. But then also on there, I stumbled on this fun little activity. It actually originated over on the Twitter platform, so you might have heard of it, and you can find it under the hashtag VSS365, and that stands for Very Short Story, 365 days a year. So if you enjoy puzzles or writing, you actually might get a kick out of this. But VSS 365, you can do this over on Twitter, or you can do it on Mastodon, which I actually like better because you get a little bit more space to write. And what happens is you get a writing prompt, a single word every single day of the year. And then your job is to take that word and incorporate it into a story. Now, what I thought would be fun, since I am the Gardener podcast over on Twitter and Mastodon, is that I would write a little gardener's version of a story. And so all my stories will have a garden theme. So let me give you yesterday's as an example, and then I'll share what I wrote today. So let me find it here quick a second. This one, it kind of cracked me up, actually. So yesterday, I stumbled on this, and the word was kraken. You know, the big sea monster, the kraken. And I thought, how can I weave the kraken into a garden story? And so just the quirky way my mind works, I was thinking about two women gardening together during the Victorian era. I was thinking a little bit about Emily Dickinson because there's that famous garden quote where Emily talks about her Aunt Lavinia and how she was just ruthless in the garden garden. She just did not let flowers amble over beds. She really kept a neat and tidy garden. And so I was channeling Lavinia when I wrote this little garden story about the Kraken. So here's what I wrote. Why are there so many weeds in this garden? Lavinia wailed in exasperation. You really want to know? Louisa inched closer and put her hoary on the ground between them. There's a monster called the Kraken. Yes, he eats sailors, that much is true, but he also comes onto dry land at night and disturbs all the seed heads and topsoil as he passes by. Theodora's missing dog is probably the work of the Kraken, too. He can cover quite a bit of ground in a single night. And so there you go, the little writing prompt of Kraken and my little garden story. And now I'll tell you the one that I did for today. I was actually kind of excited to see what the word was going to be. So the word today is bank. Yeah, just that simple, bank. So I was thinking about using it as maybe the bank of a river. And then I thought about taking it to the bank. You can take it to the bank, Missy, something like that. And so I kept thinking about that saying, you can take it to the bank. And how could I weave that into a garden story? And so thinking about the word bank, I was thinking about what's a good last name for a banker. So I Googled top bankers, and of course the last name Rothschild came up, so I used that. And then I was thinking about an herbalist that had a dog, and she was putting together herbs for a sick banker, and then she was going to give the basket to her dog and say, take it to the bank. And so here's the story that I came up with for today's word, bank. And again, my focus or my extra level of challenge here is the fact that I'm going to take these words and then write a garden story. So for me, it's got to be a garden story. So here's what I wrote for today. Next on the list was Mr. Rothschild. He still had that terrible cough. Ophelia grabbed one more onion and nestled it next to the sage, thyme, and ginger. You can take this one to the bank, Missy. Missy took the basket and trotted out the door. Except for the onions, she loved being an herbalist's dog. Missy knew that when Mrs. Rothschild greeted her, she would get a biscuit, some warm milk, and maybe even a new ribbon. Ta-da! That's my story. Well, as I was reading this to you, I want you to know that I did my homework. I was looking up herbal remedies for colds or flu. And so on the list, of course, was onion, because onion is great for a cough, in addition to herbs like sage, thyme, ginger, and rosemary. And then I also did a little bit of research on dogs to see what smells do dogs hate. And they don't like onions, they don't like garlic, and they also don't care for the aromatics, the herbs. But I thought in this instance, I would just have Missy be more sensitive to the onions and especially not care for that. And then the last thing that I looked up to make the story even more authentic was to do a little bit of research on what did dogs get for treats in the 17 or 1800s? Because I was imagining the story being set in that time period. And of course, it mentioned bread, leftover bread or biscuits. And then, of course, the warm milk was also something that was given to dogs during that time period. So that's why I incorporated those elements into the story. Anyway, if you want to play along, if you'd like to join me and write some garden stories over on Mastodon, go ahead and set up an account. It does not matter what server you're on. If you're trying to find me there and you're having trouble, just search for the hashtag Gardeners of Mastodon. You'll definitely find me there, or even just the hashtag garden, because there are not that many gardeners yet over on Mastodon. So it's a small community. You'll be able to find people there pretty easily. And I have found it to be a very, very friendly and fun space. So I hope to see you there. All right, let's get to today's garden history. Today in garden history, we celebrate the birthday of the English naturalist and writer John Ray, who was born on this day, November 29th in 1627. In 1660, John published a catalog of Cambridge plants. He developed his own system for classifying plants based on their observed similarities and differences, a very simple and obvious system. And it was this work that led John to attempt a definition of the word species. So he was clearly thinking about ways to distinguish one plant from another. And in his book, History of Plants, John was the first scientist to use the terms petal and pollen. So we have John to thank for that, John Ray. John also wrote a collection of English proverbs. He was multi-talented. And in one of his proverbs for summer, John wrote, "If the 1st of July be rainy weather, it will rain, more or less, for 4 weeks together." So hopefully, the 1st of July, 2023, it will not rain. Keep your fingers crossed. All right, and today we also celebrate the birthday of the American teacher, writer, transcendentalist, and reformer Amos Bronson Alcott. He was born on this day, November 29th in 1799. In most aspects of his life, Amos was ahead of his time. He was an abolitionist and an advocate for women's rights, and he also advocated for a plant-based diet. That was unique for that period of time. Amos, of course, was a gardener, and he once wrote, "Who loves the garden still his Eden keeps, perennial pleasures, plants, and wholesome harvest reaps." In 1830, Amos married a pretty woman named Abigail May, and together they had 4 daughters, and you might already be guessing this, but the second oldest daughter was Louisa May Alcott, American writer and poet, was also born on this day in 1832. So she was born the same day as her dad, just 33 years later. So little fun fact, I just put that together as I was preparing the stories for today. So it turns out that Louisa May Alcott grew up in the company of her parents' friends and fellow transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry David Thoreau, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Can you imagine growing up in the house with those gentlemen stopping by for a visit? That's a pretty cool way to grow up. Well, in 1868, Louisa wrote the book that she is probably most famous for, Little Women. And in it, she wrote these garden-inspired words. Joe had learned that hearts, like flowers, cannot be rudely handled, but must open naturally. Louisa could also be witty. She once wrote, "Money is the root of all evil, and yet it is such a useful root that we cannot get on without it, any more than we can without potatoes." Fun little quote. Today, we also remember Edward Hummel, the American plantsman and hybridizer. He died on this day, November 29th, in 1978. Edward and his wife, Minnie, ran Hummel's Exotic Gardens of Southern California for 43 years. They specialized in cacti, succulents, bromeliads, and orchids. And I found this little fun tidbit when I was researching Edward and Minnie Hummel. It turns out that in 1935, the couple was featured in a Quaker State motor oil advertisement. Who knew? And so the young Hummel family is on the cover of this magazine for Quaker State Motor Oil, and they're in their home cactus garden. Edward is there. He's in the middle of the garden. He's hunched over. He's examining a cactus specimen while his daughter, Marquetta, and his son, Edward, are gathered round him. And then the mother, Minnie, is standing behind them looking on. Well, this ad, as you can imagine, garnered plenty of attention, not for motor oil, but for Edward and Minnie's cactus garden. And soon, because of this photo, Edward and Minnie were fielding requests from American gardeners for more information about cactus. And the letters gave Edward and Minnie the idea to start a mail order business for their plants, something that was pretty cutting edge for the nursery business almost 100 years ago. And I have to say that even in our modern times, it took a while for buying plants online to take off. And yet, just in this past month, I've probably received 3 or 4 plants by mail. And that never used to happen to me a couple of years ago. So it's becoming more and more common. Well, during 1943, in World War II, Edward published a book. It was called Hummel's Victory Picture Book. And the cover of this little book featured a photo of 2 6-foot-tall barrel cacti. They were joined at the base, at the trunk, and then as the cacti grew, they leaned away from each other and they formed a perfect V for victory. And Edward must have taken a picture of it. I can just see him trooping through the desert and stumbling on this cactus that makes a perfect V for victory, something on everyone's mind during World War II. And so this book became a smash hit. Gardeners loved it. Cactus gardeners fell in love with it. So, like any good businessman, Edward quickly started to put together subsequent editions. But it was in that first edition, the one with the cactus that makes a V, that Edward wrote a note to his customers in the foreword that I thought you would find very interesting. Edward was a marketer. Edward wrote, "Perhaps you will wonder at receiving this free picture book, which contains no prices of plants. If you enjoy a few minutes of interest and relaxation in looking it over, it will have fulfilled its obvious purpose. If your interest and curiosity are stirred to the point that you write us for further information, it will have fulfilled its hidden purpose." So that was the goal behind this picture book, to get people to write to the Hummel Nursery and request plants. Pretty clever. Well, after the war, the fumes from LAX, the airport, actually drove the Hummels to find a new home for their nursery. And they actually settled in Carlsbad. They purchased an existing nursery that they stumbled on. The founder of that nursery, Dr. Robert Poindexter, had died unexpectedly. And the Poindexter nursery was a perfect fit because it turned out that Robert shared the Hummel's passion for cacti and succulents. And so it was Robert's son, John, who finalized the sale. Edward was especially interested in propagating and selling drought-resistant plants in his nursery. And that's a subsection of plants that is still pretty popular today, especially as the western part of the United States still deals with drought. Edward won many awards for his plants, and he was primarily known for his outstanding work with bromeliads. So there you go. Happy heavenly birthday to Edward C. Hummel. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Flower Flash by Louisa Miller. Well, this book came out last year in 2021, and Louisa Miller, if you've never heard of him, is a celebrated floral designer and a self-described flower bandit. I love that name. Well, the publisher writes this about Flower Flash by Louisa Miller. Before dawn, one morning in October of 2016, renowned New York-based floral designer Louis Miller stealthily arranged hundreds of brightly colored dahlias, carnations, and mums into a psychedelic halo around the John Lennon Memorial in Central Park. The spontaneous floral installation was Miller's gift to the city, an effort to spark joy during a difficult time. Nearly 5 years and more than 90 flower flashes later, these elaborate flower bombs, bursts of jubilant blooms and trash cans over bus canopies, on construction sites and traffic medians have brought moments of delight and wonder to countless New Yorkers and flower lovers everywhere, and it's earned Louis Miller the nickname Flower Bandit. And then, as I suspected, the publisher goes on to talk about Louis's work during the pandemic. They write, after New York City entered lockdown, Miller doubled down, creating flower flashes outside hospitals to express gratitude for frontline healthcare workers and throughout the city to raise spirits. And this book is a gorgeous and poignant visual diary that traces the phenomenon from the first spontaneous flower flash to even more profound installations of the pandemic through a kaleidoscope collage of photos that document each flower flash, including behind-the-scenes snapshots, Miller's inspiration material, fan contributions, and more. So that's what the publisher tells us about this book. But Louis actually begins his story this way. When pressed to define my own vision, a few words come to mind: abundance, contrast, joy, folly, energy. And I love what he writes here. Flowers are a medium like no other. They exist to be beautiful, to attract butterflies and bees. It's a simple but astounding life's mission. Yet all too often, this profound essence is suffocated under the weight of other meaning. We humans assign arbitrary significance to almost everything, and in the process, snuff out the true purpose of that thing. Flowers are not spared this imposition. Gladiolas can be dismissed as ghastly, lilies as rancid, and carnations as tacky. Such horrible words to describe flowers, and it doesn't stop there. The cacophony of derogatory remarks is endless. Cheap, garish, weedy, too country, gaudy, pretentious. It can make the most ambitious flower lover hesitant to create anything for fear of damnation from the taste gods. And then Louis writes this: the flower flash is my antidote to all of that. Flower flashes celebrate all the good that flowers embody and have to offer us mortals. In a flash, every flower benefits equally from a sort of floral democracy. And like most democracies, the flash's success is largely dependent on the hardworking, unsung flowers that support the more delicate and fashionable blooms. Precious sweet peas share company with unloved carnations. Chrysanthemums make nice with English garden roses. And it makes sense that this is the recipe for a successful flash, because New York City, the birthplace of these random acts of beauty, is built on the same principle. Like a true flower flash, Gotham City is a glorious mashup of all kinds of people and personalities. And since the roads aren't lined with roses, the flower flashes will be. Isn't that wonderful? I love Louis's story, and the pictures in this book are just so joyous. This really would make a wonderful book for a gardener for Christmas, so please keep it in mind. This book is 240 pages of flower flash, flower power with the bandit himself, Lewis Miller, flower lover, flower advocate, and joyous bringer of random acts of beauty. You can get a copy of Flower Flash by Lewis Miller and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $16. And while I'm at it, I just want to take a quick second and talk to you about these prices that I share with you on the show. So what I do is when I'm recommending a garden book, I try to give you the lowest price that I can find. And that usually means a used copy. And I have very rarely ever had a problem getting a used copy of a book on Amazon. They're usually pretty decent. I would say great quality. But that means that when I recommend these books, that if a lot of people hear that and then respond and run out to Amazon, that they will buy those books at that price. And then the books that remain will be a little higher priced. So if you hear about a book and you don't mind buying a used copy, well then jump on it quickly. Get out to Amazon so you can get that low price that I mention on the show. All right, we end today's show with a botanic spark that celebrates one of the all-stars of horticulture. Today, we celebrate the birthday of Gertrude Jekyll, the British horticulturist, garden designer, photographer, writer, and artist. She was born on this day, November 29th, in 1843. Gertrude Jekyll was one of the most influential garden designers of the early 20th century. She created a spectacular garden at her property called Munstead Wood in England, and she also created over 400 gardens across Europe and in the United States. Today, the Gertrude Jekyll pink rose is considered a gardener favorite, and the rose Munstead Wood honors Gertrude's garden and is one of the most splendid wine red roses. Now, Gertrude had a good sense of humor. In her book on gardening, I found this lovely quote. Gertrude wrote, "The dahlia's first duty in life is to flaunt and to swagger and to carry gorgeous blooms well above its leaves, and on no account to hang its head." And she also wrote, "When I pick or crush in my hand a twig of bay, or brush against a bush of rosemary, or tread upon a tuft of thyme, I feel that here is all that is best and purest and most refined and nearest to poetry of the sense of smell." Finally, Gertrude also shared some thoughts on gardening and her love for gardening, and I thought it was the perfect way to end the show today. Gertrude wrote, "The love of gardening is a seed that once sown never dies, but grows to the enduring happiness that the love of gardening gives." And isn't that the truth? We get so much more back from our gardens than we could ever put into them. They are such givers, and that's why we love them so much. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener once again. And by the way, look me up on Mastodon. I hope you get an account there, and I'd love to read your garden stories using the hashtag VSS365. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. Missy knew that when Mrs. Rothschild, Louisa grew up in the company of her parents' friends and fellow transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's a hard name for me today. Can you imagine having those gentlemen for friends? Mom, I want friends my own age. Today, Gertrude Jekyll's pink. Today, the Gertrude Jekyll. Wow, I'm having trouble. Let's keep going. We got to finish this. Plow forward. Onward.